right, thank you, Megan, and it's really great to see so many faces in person. The pandemic times were really brutal, so I'm really glad to be able to be together again. So I was actually originally hired for the Octo project to work on the original version of crops. So if you haven't heard about it, I'll try to do a little bit of history on that. But what we found over time is that there was a need for customizing the actual container for doing your builds, right? And so that's what this talk is about. So I now work for Kconfig, we're a consultancy, and Eilish, that you may know as Beth, or Pidge, works for Kconfiglib, also a consultancy. And this was a collaborative project, but honestly, she did most of the work for this. So Kconfig, we're a services company. We specialize in embedded Linux and open source software. We do everything, literally everything. Nothing scares us. So I actually did an OTA update from Windows to Linux in the field on thousands of devices, and it works. So just nothing scares us. We're actually based in San Jose, but the reality is we're global. We've got folks all over. And Kconfiglib is another open source and embedded services company. They're in the top 20 in the list of contributors to the Linux kernel. They're based in EU and North America. So what was crops originally? Okay, 2015, set your Wayback Machine. Okay, what was Docker in 2015? It was pretty rough, actually. And one of the things that it actually helped, though, is we could finally have the same binary thing, right, quote unquote, running on Windows, Mac, or Linux, right? So in this case, what's the thing I want to be running? I want the build container to be running, right? I want the Yocto project developer experience to be running on Windows or Mac or whatever, right? The other thing is this was all about developer workflow experience, and in those days, IDEs were really, really important, and so we're trying to hook together cross tool chains and a whole bunch of other things. So it was mostly about SDK integration. Windows subsystem for Linux, completely useless in those days. It just didn't help us at all, and we tried a lot. The Mac and Windows file systems being different meant that we actually had to run Samba containers in order to make that work. That still works now, but anyway, this is what it was all about. What everybody uses the crops containers now for is basically CI, right? Or just some kind of like, here's a very good known, this is always going to work for you, established build system, right? There's zero question it's going to work. Okay, if Docker runs and you've done the file system, a little bit of caveat, it will work, right? Most folks these days, as I said, are using it for continuous integration. What we're trying to do here with this talk is actually enable the vendors that want to deliver their SDK and their developer workflow. So it's almost like we came back full circle, back to the original need, but from a completely different way of doing it. So I always have to give this talk, or with this slide when I talk about containers, okay? Containers are not virtual machines. This is not downloading some cloud image from Ubuntu and running everything in it. It's not your full desktop. It shouldn't be, right? They're ephemeral. Don't think it's going to be running forever. Kill it. Let it go. Don't worry about it. Build a new one. It doesn't matter. Let it go, okay? It should only have what you need in it. I will argue that what we have now is actually not the minimal content, all right? But it is close. That's all it should be. Don't put more in your containers than what you actually needed, right? It's the same thing as Yocto and embedded. Like, we should all have this mindset. What you're putting in your product should only be what your product needs to be running, right? You don't want X11 in there, maybe. You don't want GCC on your target, et cetera, right? So just don't think of containers as virtual machines. It's not that far off in concept, but it just isn't, and it shouldn't be. So we've got a few use cases that we have in mind for why this tool needed to be created. So You're a user, you've got some extra applications that you need to add on top of the existing crops containers, right? You need repo, you need costs, you need some special tool that works with some other thing, whatever it is, right? You need some library that has to be installed in order for your build to work, right? It's not in the base crops containers. If you ask me to put it in, I'm going to tell you no, because only you need it, okay? Where this really started hitting to be a problem, and I was dealing with this myself in my former employer, is you're a vendor, and now you need to put your special sauce, your SDK, your layers, all of your special steps that are needed. I mean, I've seen 1,500 line local.conf files that are shipped with a repo as product. No, okay, this is not the right way to do it. And then the last bit is if you don't want to distribute a binary container, because you've got reasons, right? There are legal issues and so on there, then you distribute the way to build the container, okay? So our design goals were we wanted to reuse what we had already been doing, right? Don't keep reinventing the wheel just because you want to do something different. See how you can reuse what's already out there. And this is the way I approach everything, right? So people are always recreating a brand new test framework. Every new team that starts doing Yocto starts writing their own test framework, their own build system, their own build scripts, their own containers. You're wasting time. You should have been jumping straight into what you needed to do. We wanted it to be menu-driven and extensible, meaning that the setup of it should be easy and understandable. We don't really want you to be a Docker file or container file expert. And it can't go off into the weeds, right? We can't get all hung up on which setup, layers setup tool you're going to use, right? We'll never, ever, ever have an agreement on what that's going to be. If you have 5 people in the room, you're going to get 8 different opinions about what layer setup tool is going to be. It needs to do what containers do. It does one thing well. And the thing that's really hard right now for most people who are not that familiar with Docker, files and containers and everything, is they kind of screw up on extending the existing containers, the existing Pocky container or whatever. And it cannot break continuous integration because the only reason that the crops containers still work as basically the only person running it for like 4 years is everything was in continuous integration being tested. So I always knew it was either working or busted every Friday. So Tim and Eilish start doing these crazy weekly Kvetchathon meetings. Sometimes we talk about technical stuff, and sometimes we just, complain to each other about life, whatever. But it turned out like you can't, this is like, water cooler time, right? So you can't underestimate how much stuff we ended up bouncing around each other. Lots of talks about different menuing systems, whether or not we should just stick with costs, but we couldn't. We need these other things. Trying to decide whether we should write our own thing or reuse other things, right? So I had done a very, very similar project to what we have now, except I went off into the weeds with Python and curses, and it was a very, very interactive thing. And, there's a library that we installed into a Docker container, and then you just do a plugin for that. And I handed it to teams that should have been able to figure this out, and they thought it was too much code to change like 3 lines of code in their Python to install their new system. But we should expect embedded devs know how to use Kconfig, right? Hopefully. If people don't know how to use Kconfig and menu config, they probably should not be claiming to be embedded developers. So here's your great big QR code. This is where you can get it. It's been up on GitHub for a while now. So everything I'm going to demo here is from there. So without further ado, take it away, Eilish.
Hi folks, it's Eilish. And I'm here to show you crops generator. So this is crops generator, and you can get it from GitHub in the crops repository right there. And it is a Kconfig system to utilize the upstream crops containers that we create within the crops project for your own nefarious purposes. I guess the easiest way to show this is to go within the menuing system. Right now it's fairly straightforward, but because it is Kconfig based, it's also very extensible. So we can extend it pretty much to do whatever we need it to. Right now what we have is the ability to change the username, user shell, to create your own special sauce username and user home directory. So let's say you didn't want to call this Yocto user, you wanted to call it my special sauce user, you could do that. The host OS, this is kind of the part that people are most interested in. We can target any host OS that is supported by either Yocto project, and in the core crops configurator, that's what we do. Or if you want to support your own host OS, you can add that to this as well. Let's say you and your special build system have support for Ubuntu 16.04. You can add that to the host OS. What we can also do is use the external toolchain. The external toolchain relies on two files. One is called toolchain.docker, which is in the config directory, and the other is called toolchain.run. Toolchain.docker is a Docker fragment which sets up the toolchain on the actual Docker container, and toolchain.run is a pre-running setup script. Now, one of the things that we had to do was kind of ensure that how toolchain.run was called was consistent, so it needs to be a script that takes a -d with the Docker context as the argument. So I'll show you that in a moment. Now, we're not going to use this because it takes a while to download some tool chains, and no one wants to wait for that. In this case, one of the other things we can do is include the build system on the container. Now, most people, when they are using this, aren't going to want to do this, but in our case, there's really good reasons to be able to have that build system on the container, or most of it on the container, with kind of your build area and your deploy area off container in a mounted workspace, and have additional layers as well off onto the external container. Let's say I'm creating a build system that has a SDK that is very specific to my hardware. I want the build system, but I don't want people to be able to kind of go in there and do too much damage around there. I want them to use layers and all that to be able to change the core functionality of the build system. Well, this is how you do this. So in this case, we are going to add Pocky to the build system. We're going to add the build system. And if you notice, there's a git example.docker. Yes, there's also a CAS example, and there's also a repo example. I haven't done it yet, but there will be an OE layer setup example as well. And one of the design decisions that Tim and I made very early on was which layer management system are we going to use? And we decided against getting involved in that argument because no matter which one we use, someone was going to say, what about my layer management tool? And we didn't want to get into that, and honestly, that's not the purpose of this tool. So we decided to play a little agnostic and just say, whatever the way you're doing your repository management, well, that's up to you, and you just have it in a Docker fragment. And then let's say I have my own Docker registry URI. I have my own registry namespace. I can set that up within here. What I can also do is change the location of a lot of the config parts. So let's say instead of, I want to use crops configurator, but I don't want to distribute a Docker file because I'm worried about legal ramifications. What I want to distribute is my version of crops configurator to let people build their own. That's easily done by setting your own entry points, environments, packages, repo, toolchain, and changing the location of where crops is going to look for, or crops configurator is going to look for them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to save our configuration. And if you've done any work on the Linux kernel, this should all look kind of familiar to you. And what we're going to do now is we are going to use crops generator, point to the Kconfig, and point to the Docker context that we want to create, and create.
Demo gods bite you even
I
pre-canned.
found bug. Oh, and I know why I found a bug. I found a bug because we are no longer supporting Ubuntu 18.04. And it didn't get taken out of someplace. So let me do this real quick. And I can show you how easy it is to actually extend this. So we're going to take out Ubuntu 18.04. Now we're going to regenerate. Let's do 20. And now we've created the our crops.
So I just generated the Docker file and container file and so on, right?
So this is, again, the Docker file that is generated from the crops configurator. We copy the entry points over. This is used for headless builds so that we can just kind of do this very similar to how the CI system does it. There needs to be some rethinking about how we do entry points within crops configurator. I haven't gotten that far yet, but for right now, for our purposes, it kind of works the way we need it to. We add the user, we've shown the user, we run all the additional apt-get, so we're going to add a few additional things. You may want to add like a whole bunch of additional things. You may want to take away some of the things that we have. One of the things that we really had a bunch of requests for is, oh, hey, can you add my package to crops? And we really needed to minimize the amount of packages that we put into crops to just the bare essentials.
It's probably too much now.
So in this case, we've added two things that aren't in upstream crops yet that need to be IP route 2 and IP utils ping. We've also added git, VM, tree, Python 3 pip in order to be able to, just justify that we can add additional packages. Next, we can set environmental variables, and these are set within the config directory. And if we look in, we can show that. So again, these are set there. And then the next thing we need to do is just build the container. So what we're going to do here is we're going to run the Docker build. And this is going to pull down Ubuntu 2004, pull down the crops Pocky container, and build all of this on top of it. Now you'll see here we're doing the git clone for the Yo distro and bringing that onto the container itself. And I'll show you how we set this up to actually do development on the container without actually having it on the container.
And that distro uses Git submodules.
And I'll pause here while this builds.
The magic of television. Your build
Now
is
that
done.
we have the container built, what we can do now is actually run the container.
And that's basically how you would run a normal crops
And
container
what we're
now.
going to do here is we're going to mount a workspace, and that will be where all our build artifacts and things go.
So now we're inside a container, and she's just looking at the README to figure out what she's supposed to do to make this particular distro build, right? So there's no difference than if you were just in a terminal.
Now there is an environmental variable that I don't remember. There we go. Forget. This will tell me how to set that.
And this is stuff that you could have added into the configuration in the scripts to begin with to have it already be ready in the container if you so desired, but we're still a little early days on this, but we're trying to show you how it can be used. Going back to Ross's talk earlier, right? You want to be reusing your state and your download DIRs, right? So because that...
Now, if I wanted to add some additional BB layers, I can add them in here.
These are actually editable because they are in the workspace.
But for this, we're not going to do that. And I know that I need to set the Docker repo bit to something, and I don't add Docker repo to none.
So all the build stuff is immutable.
And
right?
now
Containers,
we
but
have
these are all
this all
config
being
files
built.
in your bind-mounted workspace.
On the container with
So now she's moving into that workspace that's native on your host, but it's the same place the container was using. And now you can see your state and so on.
all the shared state cache and temp going into workspace area. And this is how we do how we extend the crops container using crops generator. Thank you. And Tim can answer any questions you may have. Hi, folks. It's Sailesh.
Sorry.
And
Next slide. There we go. Okay. So hopefully, it gives you an idea. It probably looks harder than it actually is to set it up and use it. Thank you. Okay. So what we want is a lot more pre-canned examples to make it really, really obvious exactly how you do those use cases we talked about earlier, right? Especially for all of you hardware vendors and so on that you're trying to get your SDK published and packaged, and you're trying to get your end users up and going. So we need to make sure that stuff is really, really well, really obvious how to do it. We especially are going to need the alternate toolchain examples, because this is usually the special sauce the vendors are going to bring as their own SDK and other tools. We want to make sure we're showing how to, basically do what the crops container is already doing and things like that, and basically show you how to build your own crops container from scratch, essentially, right? Testing's all manual right now, so we need to get that into the, currently everything's GitHub Actions, because all the crop stuff is on GitHub. We need to revisit what the minimal container requirements are, because honestly what we have in there is from 2015, right? Plus a few things have been added, not that much has been taken away. There's some assumptions about needing to test public VNC and things like that. As she said, the command and entry points, this is really the magic at the very, very end that people tend to break with the Docker containers or with any kind of containers. And that's the stuff that we need to make that a little bit more configurable and obvious. And we actually want to start generating the containers on crops Docker Hub with the crops generator. So